They didn't arrive with whips first. They arrived with Bibles, not with chains in their hands, but with promises on their tongues. They spoke of salvation while already measuring human beings. Ascargo. And long before iron touched African skin, faith was being sharpened into a weapon. Before the ships came, before the crosses were raised on foreign shores, Africa was not empty. It was not silent. It was not waiting to be saved. Africa was alive with belief. Not belief written in books, but belief carried in breath, in drums, in rivers, in the names whispered to newborns, and the prayers spoken for the dead. Faith was not owned by kings. It was not locked inside stone buildings. It lived among the people. Every mountain had meaning. Every forest had memory. Every ancestor was present. To be African was to be connected, to land, to spirit, to community. There was no separation between the sacred and the everyday. A farmer planting seeds was performing a spiritual act. A mother singing to her child was offering prayer. A village gathering at sunset was worship. God was not distant. God was everywhere. But to European eyes, this faith was not recognized because it did not look like theirs. It had no cathedral, no Latin verses, no crowns blessed by bishops. So they called it pagan. They called it savage. They called it darkness. And in that lie, they found justification. When Europeans first reached African coasts, they did not announce slavery. They announced salvation. They claimed they had come to bring light to a land already glowing with spirit. They claimed they had come to rescue souls that were never lost. The Bible became their passport. The cross became their shield. They said, "Your gods are false. Your ancestors are demons. Your ways are sinful." And slowly, they planted doubt, not in the land, but in the people. They taught that suffering was holy, that obedience was virtue, that questioning authority was rebellion against God. This was not faith. This was conditioning. Religion did not act alone. Behind the Bible stood the crown. Kings and queens of Europe did not see Africa as a spiritual mission. They saw it as a resource: gold, land, labor, and the church gave them permission. Papal decrees declared non-Christians less than fully human. Royal charters blessed conquest. In the name of God, church and crown shook hands. Over African soil, one ruled the soul, the other ruled the body. Together, they ruled destiny. Missionaries spoke of heaven, but never spoke of freedom. They preached love, but accepted chains. They baptized African captives. On the same day, they sold them. Conversion did not bring protection. It brought control. A Christian slave was still a slave, but now one taught to obey quietly. And that was the goal, not salvation, submission. When the slave ships arrived, religion came aboard with them. On deck, prayers were spoken. Below deck, screams were swallowed. Captains quoted scripture, Sidosoims, and beneath their feet, human beings suffocated in darkness. The Bible was read aloud, not to comfort, but to command. Servants, obey your masters. Those words echoed louder than the waves. Not a single verse about freedom, not a single mention of dignity. Faith was edited. Truth was cropped. God was reduced to a tool of order. African captives were told, if you resist, you are resisting God. If you run, you are running from God. If you suffer, is God's will. Heaven was promised, but only after death. Freedom was postponed until the grave. This was not Christianity as Christ taught it. This was Christianity as empire needed it. Fear became doctrine. Silence became prayer. Conversion was never just spiritual. It was cultural execution. Names were stripped away. Languages forbidden. Songs labeled sinful. A man named Kofi became John. A woman named Amina became Mary. And with each new name, a history was buried. The past was erased, so obedience could be written in its place. And while millions suffered, the church prospered. Churches were built with money stained by chains. Pews were filled by people who never questioned where the wealth came from. Some clergy spoke against slavery, quietly, carefully, without action, but institutions remained comfortable. Because slavery was profitable. Religion did not create slavery, but made acceptable. It made brutality feel righteous. It made greed feel holy. It made empire feel ordained. Faith was not lost. It was stolen, bent, weaponized, turned into chains. They told the enslaved that God was on the side of power. But history tells a different story, because even in chains, the human spirit whispered freedom. And in the next chapter, faith would no longer serve the oppressor. They did not need more chains. They needed obedience. And for that, they opened the scripture, not to teach truth, but to bend it. Verses were selected, like weapons from an armory, not the ones about justice, not the ones about liberation, only the ones that could silence pain. Servants, obey your masters. For words, enough to crush a soul. They never read what came before it. They never explained what came after it. Context was erased. Meaning was mutilated. The Bible was not taught. It was edited. Enslaved Africans were told, your suffering is holy. Your pain is proof of faith. Your obedience will be rewarded. Not here, but in heaven. Freedom was always postponed. Justice was always delayed. Hope was pushed beyond death. And fear replaced belief. Fear of punishment. Fear of hell. Fear of God. A God redesigned to look exactly like their master. They were taught that resistance was rebellion against divine order. That escape was a sin. That questioning cruelty was blasphemy. And so, the whip became unnecessary. The mind was already enslaved. This was not the God of compassion. This was a God of hierarchy. A God who favored white skin. A God who crowned kings. A God who justified empires. This God spoke English, Spanish, Portuguese. Never Yoruba. Never Wolof. Never Akan. This God lived in churches built on stolen labor and never visited the ship's lower decks. This was not faith. It was propaganda. Every time an enslaved person cried out, scripture was thrown back at them, not as comfort, but as command. Religion became a wall between suffering and sympathy, between cruelty and conscience, between crime and accountability. And behind that wall, empires grew fat. But even then, questions survived. Quiet ones, dangerous ones. Why would just God demand endless suffering? Why would salvation require silence? Why did the God of love sound exactly like the overseer? Those questions were punished. So they learned to whisper them, to bury them, to carry them in their hearts. Waiting. The scripture was never broken. It was broken into, forced open, stripped of meaning, and turned into a lock that kept millions in place. But locks can rust, and minds can wake. They understood something crucial. As long as people remembered who they were, they would never fully submit. So identity had to be destroyed, not violently, systematically. The first thing they took was the name. Names carried lineage, history, memory, so they erased them. Kofi became John. Ao became Samuel. Zainabu became Elizabeth. Each new name was a small funeral. No drums, no prayers, no goodbyes, just silence. And in that silence, a past was buried alive. Language connects people. So was forbidden. African languages were labeled savage, unholy, dangerous. Speaking them meant punishment. And without language, stories died, songs vanished, wisdom disappeared. A people without language is easier to command. Conversion was not offered. It was enforced. You will worship this God. You will pray this way. You will forget your ancestors. Ancestors were called demons. Traditions were called witchcraft. Drums were called tools of the devil. But drums were heartbeat, and heartbeat was life. So life itself was criminalized. They said, we are making you human, but humanity was already there. They said, we are giving you morality, but morality was already lived. They said, we are saving your soul while destroying everything that made you whole. Over time, some began to believe the lie, that their past was evil, that their culture was inferior, that their suffering was deserved. This was the deepest wound, not the whip, not the chain, but shame, a poison that lingers. Long after freedom arrives, even after abolition, the damage remained. Names lost, languages broken, histories fragmented. The chains were removed, but the silence stayed. and that silence echoes. Even today, they tried to erase a people. By erasing their past, they failed because memory survives. In rhythm, in resistance, in blood, and in the next chapter, faith will no longer be a weapon of control. It will become a language of rebellion. At some point, silence becomes a decision, and the church decided to remain silent while millions were dragged in chains. The bells still rang, while bodies were packed into ships. Sermons were still delivered, while families were torn apart. Prayers were still answered, just not theirs. The church was not always ignorant. It knew, it saw, it benefited. Slave ships were insured by Christian merchants. Plantations were owned by men who knelt every Sunday. Church buildings were raised, with money soaked in suffering. Human flesh funded holy stone. And the question was never asked loudly enough. How can a faith built on love coexist with a system built on cruelty? Because asking that question would threaten comfort, and comfort was expensive. Some priests blessed ships before departure. Some pastors owned slaves themselves. Some bishops invested quietly. Not all agreed, not all supported, but institutions did, and institutions matter. The church did not create slavery, but it baptized it, wrapped it in scripture, protected it with silence, legitimized it with authority. Evil does not always scream. Sometimes it prays. But something unexpected happened. Faith refused to die. They tried to use God to break the enslaved. Instead, the enslaved found God for themselves. Not the God of the master, not the God of the overseer, but the God who heard cries. On plantations, at night, in secret gatherings, they whispered prayers. The church never taught them. They sang songs. That sounded like worship, but carried instructions for escape. Spirituals became maps. Hymns became warnings. Faith became code. Go down, Moses. Let my people go. They recognized themselves. In the story of Exodus, they were not cursed. They were captive, and captives could be freed. This was dangerous faith, a faith that did not submit, a faith that questioned power, a faith that imagined freedom. Slave owners feared this version of God because this God did not demand obedience. This God demanded justice. This God did not bless chains. This God broke them. So meetings were banned, drums were outlawed, songs were monitored, because faith, once reclaimed, became rebellion. Out of oppression, a new spiritual force was born. The Black Church, not built by empire, built by survivors. It was more than worship. It was refuge, school, planting ground. It taught literacy, preserved memory, prepared resistance. Here, faith finally spoke, in its own voice, not to control, but to heal. This is the question history still asks. Where was God during the ships, the whips, the graves? But maybe the better question is, who was speaking for God? Because God was never the one selling bodies. God was never the one writing laws to protect cruelty. God was never the one twisting scripture for profit. That was man. Religion was not the villain. Power was. Religion was simply the sharpest tool power could find. There is a difference between God and those who claim to speak for him, between faith and institution, between belief and control. The enslaved learned this truth the hard way, and when they did, religion lost its grip, because faith, once free, cannot be weaponized again. The chains are gone, but the echoes remain, in inequality, in distorted history, in churches that still struggle to admit the truth. The damage was not just physical, it was spiritual, and healing requires honesty. The chains are gone, but the echoes remain, in inequality, in distorted history, in churches that still struggle to admit the truth. The damage was not just physical, it was spiritual, and healing requires honesty. They didn't arrive with whips first. They arrived with Bibles, and they used God to justify the unjustifiable. But history remembers, and truth, no matter how deeply buried, eventually breathes. This documentary is not about blaming faith. It is about exposing how faith was stolen, twisted, and turned into chains, so it can never happen again. When religion serves power instead of humanity, it stops being holy and starts being dangerous.